Welcome back, dreamers. I hope you're set up to hear more disturbing tales. Before you drift to sleep, tell me in the comments from where you're listening from. It was the early 90s, sometime past 2 in the morning, and my boyfriend was driving me home after a night out. The streets were dead quiet, and there was that eerie stillness you get late at night when even the sound of the car engine feels loud. The neighborhoods we passed were dark and empty, with only a few streetlights casting weak halos of light that seemed to make the shadows around them even darker. The car radio was on low, just faint background noise to keep us both from dozing off, but we were mostly quiet, ready to get home. As we turned down one of the side streets, something unusual caught both of our eyes at the same time. Just up ahead, near the curb, there was a figure, someone lying on the ground. We exchanged a quick glance, both wondering if we'd really seen what we thought we did. My boyfriend slowed down, and as we got closer, the figure came more into focus. It was definitely a man, but he wasn't lying down the way you'd expect if someone had just passed out or fallen. Instead, he was kneeling, his body folded forward in a way that seemed almost staged, with his head resting on the pavement. The closer we got, the stranger it looked. His torso was bent forward, but his head was twisted to the side, facing the street. His position was so odd that I remember thinking he had to be hurt or unconscious. His arms were slack at his sides, and he was completely still, his body frozen in this unnatural pose. Even from the car, I could see that he was drenched in sweat. His shirt clung to his back and shoulders, and there were streaks of sweat glistening on his face, catching the light as our headlights swept over him. As we pulled up alongside him, I felt a jolt of unease. His face was visible now, and it looked almost wrong. His eyes were open, wide open in fact, and there was an intensity to his gaze, like he was staring straight ahead at the empty street. But his expression was empty, his face completely still, almost as if he was frozen mid-thought. Something about it struck me as desperate, like he was silently calling out for help, though he hadn't moved or reacted to our approach in any way. My boyfriend pulled over, and I felt a strange instinctive urge to help. "I'll check on him," I said quietly, opening the car door and stepping into the night air. The street felt even quieter as I got out, the silence almost pressing in on me. My footsteps echoed softly as I approached the man, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I got closer, the details became even clearer. His skin looked pale, almost waxy in the dim light, and there was a faint sheen of sweat covering his forehead. His eyes were still wide open, staring, with no sign of blinking or movement. "Hey," I called out, my voice low, almost hesitant. There was no reaction, no shift in his expression, no flicker in his eyes. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I realized he wasn't responding at all. His gaze was glassy, and I could see that his pupils were fixed, giving him an eerie, almost lifeless look. I reached out, hesitating, before touching his arm. As I touched his arm, a wave of cold seemed to radiate from his skin, so intense that it almost felt unnatural. His skin was clammy, and my fingers recoiled instinctively, a shiver running down my spine. The stillness was overwhelming, and with his wide, fixed eyes staring out blankly, it was clear that something was very, very wrong. I called out again, louder this time, half expecting him to snap out of it, to blink or shift, anything that would make this moment feel less surreal. But he remained unmoving, his eyes wide and glassy, staring at nothing. It was hard to process what I was seeing. His expression was so frozen and lifeless, yet there was something deeply unsettling in his gaze, an intensity that seemed to scream for help, even though his face was locked in a blank, almost empty stare. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign that he even knew I was there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with questions. Why was he kneeling like that? Why wasn't he moving? The way he'd positioned himself looked intentional, as though he'd carefully arranged himself in that spot. I leaned down slightly, trying to get a closer look at his face. In the dim light, his skin looked pale and waxy, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead, glistening as they caught the glow of the streetlight. His breathing was non-existent. There was no rise or fall in his chest, no soft exhale or shift in his posture. The silence felt oppressive, as if the entire world had frozen along with him. leaving me in a quiet void with nothing but the sound of my own breath. My boyfriend, who'd stayed by the car watching, called out to me, breaking the silence. I glanced back at him, and he gestured for me to come back, his expression mirroring the unease I felt. I gave one last look at the man, still hoping for some sign of life, but there was nothing, no response, no movement, just that unblinking stare that seemed to cut through the night. I slowly backed away, my steps careful, almost afraid to turn my back on him, though I couldn't have explained why. We quickly agreed that we needed help, but this was before cell phones, so we had no way to call for assistance right there. I rushed back to the car, my heart pounding, and we sped off toward my house. The unsettling image of the man burned into my memory. As we drove, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see him in the rearview mirror or watching us from the distance, but the street remained empty. Just rows of quiet houses and the dim glow of streetlights. The ride back felt surreal. My boyfriend and I barely spoke, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken thoughts and questions. The strange stillness of the night seemed to linger, like an invisible weight pressing down, and every detail of the encounter replayed in my mind. The unblinking eyes, the icy skin, the way he'd been kneeling in that exact spot, as if he were trapped in that position forever. When we finally reached my house, I rushed inside and immediately called 911. My hands were still shaking as I held the receiver, and I could hear my own voice sounding strange and distant as I described what we had seen. The operator listened carefully as I explained the location, repeating the cross streets and telling them about the man's condition. Unresponsive, not breathing, ice cold. The operator reassured me that an officer would be sent right away and asked us to stay by the phone in case they needed any additional information. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the police, calling back to verify the exact location. The officer on the line asked me to confirm the cross streets, and I repeated them, explaining once more where we'd found the man. But then the officer's tone changed. He sounded hesitant, almost puzzled, as he told me that they had arrived at the corner I'd described, but there was nothing there. No man kneeling, no body, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I double-checked the location, describing the spot in detail, the position of the streetlight, the exact curb where we'd seen him, even the landmarks nearby. The officer listened, confirming each detail, but his response was the same. The area was empty. They assured me that they would continue to search the surrounding streets, and if they found anything, they would contact me again. I hung up the phone, a strange sense of disbelief settling over me. My boyfriend and I exchanged a look, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened, but neither of us had any answers. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the encounter. The man's lifeless expression, his fixed stare, and that chillingly unnatural position haunted me, replaying in my mind whenever I closed my eyes. I checked the local newspaper obsessively, scanning for any report or mention of an incident that might explain what we'd seen. Each morning I'd unfold the paper with a strange mix of anticipation and dread, my eyes darting across the headlines, but there was nothing. No reports of a missing person, no unexplained incidents, no mention of anything unusual happening in that area. For weeks I continued looking, hoping for some kind of answer, but there was never any follow-up, no closure to the strange experience. The memory stayed vivid, every detail seared into my mind. The chill of his skin, the wide, glassy eyes, the unsettling way he'd knelt with his head twisted toward the street. Sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake, replaying it all in my mind, questioning whether there had been something we missed, something that could explain what we'd seen. But no matter how many times I went over it, the encounter remained a mystery, a fragment of an experience that seemed to defy any logical explanation. The image of that man in the street, silent and motionless, has stayed with me over the years. Even now, I can recall it as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. A chilling reminder of how, in a single instant, something ordinary can shift into the inexplicable. To this day, I still wonder what it all meant, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I find myself thinking back to that dark, empty street and the unanswered questions it left behind. My neighbor was a man in his mid-30s who mostly kept to himself. He had lived alone on our street for a few years, running his own landscaping business. I'd see him from time to time out in his yard, meticulously mowing his lawn or trimming his hedges. His yard was always immaculate, green, perfectly edged, like something out of a magazine. If we happened to be outside at the same time, he'd give a wave, maybe a quick hello, but we'd never really had long conversations. There wasn't anything odd about him, just a quiet, hard-working guy who liked to keep to himself. He wasn't unfriendly by any means. In fact, he'd occasionally offer to mow our lawn with his huge landscaping mower when he was out cutting his own. It was something he did out of the blue, never asking for anything in return. One day, as he was packing up his truck for a business trip, he approached me with a request. He asked if I could feed his cat for a few days while he was out of town. He explained that it wasn't much trouble, just a matter of stopping by once a day to refill the food and water. It surprised me a little, as I didn't even know he had a cat. I'd never heard any sounds coming from his place or seen the animal when he was outside, but he reassured me it was an indoor cat, quiet and shy, and I probably wouldn't even see it when I stopped by. He handed me a spare key to his house and gave a quick rundown of where everything was: the food, the litter box, how to get in and out. It was all pretty standard, and he seemed genuinely appreciative that I was willing to help out. He wasn't the kind of neighbor to ask for favors, so it didn't seem like a big deal. I thought about the times he'd mowed our lawn or stopped to offer advice on trimming bushes, and this felt like a small way to return the favor. As I took the key from him, I remember feeling a moment of hesitation. Not that anything felt particularly off, but I realized I had never actually been inside his house. He always kept to himself, and aside from casual exchanges over the fence or in passing, we didn't really know each other that well. I figured his home would be just as neat and organized as his yard, clean, well kept, nothing out of place. But as I agreed to help, there was a small, nagging thought in the back of my mind. I wasn't sure why, but the idea of stepping inside his house felt different from the casual interactions we'd had over the years. Still, I brushed it off, reminding myself that it was just a simple favor: feed the cat, check the water, and leave. The plan was to stop by the following morning, right after he left for his trip. I had my own routine, so I figured I'd swing by his house before work, spend no more than a few minutes inside, and be on my way. It felt straightforward enough, and I didn't think twice about what I'd find when I walked through the door. But even as I went about my evening, I couldn't shake the slight sense of curiosity about what the inside of his house might be like. The next morning, I walked over to his house, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. As I entered, the first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. The kind of silence that makes everything else seem louder. The creak of the door, the sound of my own footsteps. I closed the door behind me and immediately felt a bit out of place, like I was intruding on something private. The air was heavy, carrying a faint scent of stale air and cleaning products, with a strange hint of something metallic lingering underneath. The layout of his home was typical, but as I glanced around, I noticed something odd about the living room. It was filled with mirrors. Not just one or two, but multiple full-length mirrors positioned in unusual spots, leaning against walls and propped up on tables. They were all the same style, plain, rectangular mirrors in simple frames, but the way they were arranged felt haphazard, almost as if they'd been put there with some purpose I couldn't understand. It was unsettling in a subtle way, like each mirror was somehow watching from different angles. Then I noticed the writing. Every single mirror was covered in dense handwriting, Bible verses scrawled in small red letters that covered nearly every inch of the reflective surfaces. The writing was incredibly neat, almost precise, the kind of detail you'd expect on lined paper, but seeing it spread across the mirrors like that made it feel intense, even obsessive. The letters were tiny, so tightly packed that each verse flowed directly into the next, creating a maze of words that looked almost like wallpaper from a distance. I walked further into the room, feeling the strange weight of those verses, the way they surrounded me on all sides. Each mirror seemed to reflect the writing back into the room, creating this echo of red text wherever I looked. The messages weren't simple, inspirational quotes you'd write to keep yourself motivated. They were full verses, some I recognized, others obscure, each one written out in its entirety. It must have taken hours, maybe even days, to fill each mirror this way, and I couldn't imagine the effort it took not to smudge the marker. I glanced toward the hallway leading to the kitchen and saw more mirrors, each one covered in the same meticulous red text. Even in the small bathroom near the entryway, I found the mirror above the sink completely covered, every inch of it filled with more verses. There was something eerie about it, the way each room seemed to have its own set of reflections, filled with the same messages, the same red marker. I couldn't help but wonder what would drive someone to write like this, to cover every mirror in the house with the same verses, over and over again. After that first visit, I couldn't shake the images of those mirrors. The experience lingered with me in a way I hadn't expected. Each day I'd go back, slipping in quietly, feeling the same heavy silence as I moved from room to room, attending to the cat and making a point not to look too closely at the mirrors. But it was nearly impossible to ignore them. The verses, written so densely and precisely, were always there, surrounding me, like some kind of silent, ever-present reminder. Even if I looked away, the words seemed to fill the space, almost echoing in the quiet, making the house feel more like a place of ritual than a home. Outside, he was just the friendly neighbor again, waving to everyone as he unloaded his mower or trimmed hedges. I started noticing him more often, though, wondering if anyone else knew about the mirrors, if anyone else had been inside his house. I watched him sometimes, the way he moved, his quiet, almost reserved demeanor, and tried to reconcile it with what I'd seen. Even months later, I'd find myself thinking back to those red verses and the strange sense of purpose that must have driven him to cover every inch of those mirrors. I never asked him about it, never brought it up, and he never mentioned it either. I'd see the faint traces of red marker in my mind, almost like an afterimage, each time he'd pass by, a reminder of the hidden, meticulous world I'd seen reflected in his mirrors. As a community mental health nurse, home visits were a regular part of my job. That evening, I had an appointment with an elderly lady in London who lived alone in an attic apartment. It was winter, and the cold felt sharper as the sun disappeared, leaving the streets quiet and empty. When I arrived, the streetlights were flickering on, casting long, faint shadows over the building. The entrance to her building was worn, with paint peeling from the doorframe, and the hallway inside was dimly lit, with the type of old yellowish light you find in buildings that haven't been updated in years. The stairway leading up to her attic was narrow, with each step creaking underfoot. It felt like the kind of place where noise carried. My footsteps seemed to echo louder than usual as I climbed. By the time I reached her door, I could feel the cold seeping into the hallway, despite the building being closed off. When she opened the door, she greeted me with a rushed smile, her movements quick and a little jittery. She invited me in, and I could immediately tell that the space felt tight, cluttered. Her apartment was small. The ceiling sloped sharply because it was an attic. Every available surface seemed to be covered with something. Magazines stacked on a chair, old photographs in frames, small trinkets and knickknacks scattered across shelves. It looked like the kind of place where time had stopped, with everything arranged just so, but with a sense of disorder that came from being left untouched for too long. The heating was on, but it felt weak, and the room still had a chill to it. I kept my coat on, even as I sat down. We sat in her living room, or what passed for one. There was an old armchair that she settled into, and I found a spot on a faded sofa. The lamp in the corner gave off a weak light, and the longer I sat there, the more I noticed how dim the room actually was. There were no overhead lights, just the soft glow from the lamp, which left the corners of the room shrouded in shadow. The woman started talking almost immediately, and I could tell she was in a manic state. Her words came fast, almost breathless, jumping from one subject to another without giving me much time to respond. She talked about her day, then her family, then shifted to stories from years ago, all without pause. I tried to steer the conversation, to ask her questions about how she was feeling, how she was managing, but she barely registered my input. I kept nodding, trying to follow along, occasionally glancing around the room as she spoke. As she continued talking, I started to notice how isolated the apartment felt. The attic windows were small, barely letting in any light, and by now, the winter evening had fully set in. The room was dark except for the small pool of light cast by the lamp. The quiet outside was thick, almost oppressive. There was no sound from the street below, no neighbors, no movement, just the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the building settling. The shadows in the room grew longer as the light dimmed, and the apartment felt more enclosed, like the space was shrinking around us. It wasn't anything specific that was unsettling, but the combination of the darkening room, the heavy silence, and her rapid, unfocused talking left me with a vague sense of unease. After a while, the lady had been talking non-stop, her words tumbling out so quickly that it was hard to follow her train of thought. I decided to gently change the direction of the conversation to something more practical. I leaned forward slightly and asked her, "So, are you going to cook some dinner for yourself later?" It seemed like a harmless question, meant to ground her a bit and assess if she was managing her daily routines. She paused, which was unusual given how much she had been talking. Her head tilted slightly to one side, like she was considering the question. Then, in the same calm voice she'd used throughout our conversation, she replied, "No, my friend is going to do it." That took me by surprise. From what I understood, she lived alone, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone else in the apartment since I arrived. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes elderly patients speak about their friends or family coming by when they're not really there, especially in a manic state. So I responded, "Oh, when's your friend coming over?" She didn't answer immediately, which made the moment feel a little heavier. Her eyes wandered away from me, scanning the room before finally settling somewhere just behind me. The quiet that had settled into the room after she stopped talking felt oddly thick, like the air was pressing in around us. Then she calmly said, "He's already here." I froze for a moment, processing her words. My first thought was that maybe someone had quietly entered while we were talking, maybe a family member or neighbor, but I hadn't heard anything. The apartment had been completely silent apart from our conversation, and it was a small space. If someone had come in, I would have seen or heard them. Still trying to keep things light and hoping it was just confusion on her part, I asked casually, "Where is he then?" Without hesitation, she lifted her hand and pointed directly over my shoulder. "He's standing right there." I turned my head slowly, unsure of what I would see. The corner she was pointing to had been in shadow for most of my visit, dimly lit by the weak light from the single lamp. I hadn't paid much attention to it. It was just another shadowed area in a dark apartment. But as I turned, my eyes adjusted, and I saw him, a man standing perfectly still in the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the lamplight. He was standing so still that it took me a second to fully register that he was actually there. He was tall, his body rigid, arms hanging at his sides. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared in my direction. His face was partially hidden by the shadows, but I could make out enough to see that he had been watching us the entire time. The shock of seeing him there hit me hard. How had I not noticed him? The apartment wasn't big, and I'd been sitting in full view of the room for half an hour. Had he been standing there the whole time? My mind raced to catch up, trying to figure out what was going on. I glanced back at the lady, who was still looking at him, as if his presence was completely normal, as if he had been part of the conversation all along. There was no alarm in her expression, just the same calm demeanor she'd had when she first mentioned him. For a moment, I wondered if I had missed something earlier. Had she introduced him? Had I somehow overlooked a key part of the interaction? My pulse quickened. The man's silence made the situation feel surreal. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge that I had turned to look at him. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and I couldn't tell if he was ill, confused, or just deeply disturbed. There was something unsettling in the way he stood there, unnervingly quiet, as if he was a part of the room itself. I couldn't believe that someone had been in the room the entire time without me realizing it. The apartment wasn't large, and the room was small enough that I should have seen him the moment I walked in, but I hadn't. There had been no sound, no shifting or movement, just the heavy silence, and the older lady's constant talking. Now that I saw him, I couldn't unsee him. He was just standing there, his eyes fixed on me, his gaze intense but devoid of any real emotion. My mind raced to make sense of it. Was he another patient? It seemed likely, given his unresponsiveness and the strange situation. His skin was pale, and his face had a gaunt, sunken look that suggested he wasn't in good health. I tried to recall if his name had come up in our service, but nothing about him seemed familiar. My heart was beating fast, and I couldn't shake the growing sense of discomfort that filled the room. He still hadn't said a word, hadn't moved an inch, just standing there as if he'd been part of the shadows all along. The lady had gone back to talking, almost as though nothing was unusual. She seemed completely unfazed by the man's presence, continuing her monologue as if he wasn't even there. She didn't address him, didn't interact with him in any way. She just looked back at me, her focus shifting between me and whatever stream of thoughts she was working through in her mind. I couldn't bring myself to look away from him. Every few seconds, I'd glance back at the man in the corner, expecting him to move, to say something, to do anything, to acknowledge that he was aware of me being there. But he remained silent, still staring. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, as if the temperature had dropped slightly in his direction. I found myself sitting up straighter in my chair, my senses on high alert, as I tried to figure out how to wrap up the visit without escalating the situation. It was strange how normal everything else seemed. The soft hum of the radiator in the corner, the ticking of a clock on the wall, the muffled sounds of traffic far below on the street. Yet, with that man standing there, everything felt wrong. The lady's voice was still chattering on, but it became background noise as I weighed my options. Should I acknowledge him? Would that provoke him? What if he had been standing there the entire time and was waiting for something? The possibilities kept swirling in my mind, none of them particularly comforting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I decided to finish up the visit. I carefully chose my words, making sure not to show any signs of the anxiety building up inside me. I stood up slowly, trying to make the movements as calm and steady as possible. "I think that's enough for today," I said, keeping my voice neutral. The lady nodded absent-mindedly, still rambling about something that no longer registered. I glanced toward the door, feeling a strange mix of urgency and reluctance to turn my back on the man in the corner. As I gathered my things, I kept the man in my peripheral vision, hoping that he wouldn't make any sudden movements. He didn't. He stayed exactly where he was, still watching me with that unnerving gaze. I felt the tension ease ever so slightly when I reached the door, and the lady waved me off cheerfully, as if the entire encounter had been completely normal. But as I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind me, I exhaled sharply, the cold air of the hallway hitting me like a shock. I couldn't stop thinking about him on the walk back to my car. His presence had felt almost unnatural, like he wasn't fully part of the room, but still an essential part of the strange atmosphere. I glanced back at the apartment building, half expecting to see him standing at the window, but it was just as still and dark as it had been when I arrived. As I drove away, the unease stayed with me, that silent presence lingering in my mind long after I left the building. As a 911 dispatcher, you get used to recognizing certain voices, especially in rural areas where the same people might call multiple times for help. When the call came in from the elderly woman, I immediately recognized her. She and her husband lived in a remote part of West Virginia, the kind of place where houses are spaced miles apart and it takes a while for emergency services to arrive. This wasn't the first time she'd called, and I knew from previous conversations that she had ongoing health problems. That evening, her voice came through the line, soft and strained. "I'm having trouble breathing again," she said, her words coming out in labored gasps. I could hear the raspy edge in her tone, and it sounded like she was worse off than the last time I had spoken to her. As I pulled up her information on the screen, I kept talking to her, a habit I'd developed to assess the seriousness of the situation. "How bad is it tonight?" I asked, knowing her history from prior calls. She wasn't the type to panic easily, so the fact that she'd called in was a signal that something was definitely wrong. Her breathing was heavy, and there was a pause before she responded. I don't know, she replied, her breath catching between words. It's worse this time, I think. I immediately dispatched an ambulance, knowing it would take a bit longer given her location. The crew radioed back quickly, advising a 15-minute ETA, which wasn't unusual for such a rural area. Still, in a medical emergency, every minute felt like an eternity, and I could hear the effort it was taking for her to talk. She was struggling to breathe, and I knew I needed to keep her on the line, talking to her, keeping her calm while we waited for help. Okay, I've got an ambulance coming to you. Just hang in there, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I could hear the faint sounds of her home in the background, a ticking clock, the occasional creak of a floorboard. The quietness of the house made her labored breathing stand out even more. I asked her about her husband. I knew they lived alone and that he had his own health challenges. How's your husband doing tonight? I asked, hoping to distract her from her distress for a moment. He's asleep, she replied, her voice faint. He doesn't know what's happening. I reassured her that the ambulance was on the way, but I could feel the weight of those 15 minutes hanging in the air. It was a rural part of West Virginia, and I'd dealt with these calls before, where help takes a little longer because of how isolated the area is. The thought of her struggling alone while her husband slept in the next room was hard to shake. I tried to keep her talking, asking about how she was feeling, whether she was sitting down, little things that might help keep her focused. Her breathing grew heavier, and I could tell she was getting more exhausted. The pauses between her words grew longer. The conversation was basic, but every detail seemed important in those moments. Just keeping her on the line was the priority. I could hear the occasional rustling sound, maybe from her shifting in her chair or bed, and I pictured her in that quiet house, waiting, trying to hold on. The EMTs radioed in again, 10 minutes away now. I passed that information on to her, trying to offer reassurance. They're close now, just hang on, I said. Her responses had slowed down, and I wasn't sure if it was because she was getting weaker or just focusing all her energy on breathing. Finally, the ambulance called in one last time, saying they were pulling up to her house. They're at your door now, I said. Go ahead and get up if you can and answer the door. Help is right there. There was a pause, and then she said, okay, in a faint, brazy voice. Without any further hesitation, she hung up. That wasn't out of the ordinary. Sometimes people would hang up the moment they heard the ambulance was at their door, assuming they didn't need to stay on the line any longer. I marked the call as completed and waited for the paramedics to confirm they had her in care. Everything had seemed routine, if a little tense given her breathing difficulties, but the next call I received would change the entire situation in a way I hadn't expected. After the woman hung up, I sat back, expecting the paramedics to confirm shortly that they had reached her and were providing care. A couple of minutes passed before the EMTs called in, reporting something unusual. No one was answering the door. Given the woman's respiratory distress, I assumed she might have collapsed after hanging up or was too weak to reach the door. It wasn't uncommon for elderly patients to become too frail to respond quickly, especially after exerting themselves just by talking. I relayed this to the EMTs and suggested they continue trying. Shortly after, a sheriff's unit arrived on the scene to assist. When the sheriff confirmed the address and reported no response, he made the decision to breach the door. I expected the next update to be straightforward. They would find her inside, provide treatment, and get her to the hospital. But instead, 5 minutes later, the paramedic called back, asking a question that sent an immediate chill through me. He wanted to confirm who the caller was. I told him it was the elderly woman, the resident of the house, whom I had been speaking to only minutes earlier. There was a pause on the other end, one that felt far too long, before the paramedic quietly mentioned that something was off. Unsure what he meant, I repeated the details of the call, explaining that I had spoken to the woman directly, and she had sounded short of breath but responsive. That's when the paramedic requested to speak with the supervisor, his tone carrying an unmistakable sense of confusion. The supervisor picked up the call, and I listened in, feeling a growing sense of unease. The paramedic explained that they had found the elderly woman inside the house, but she had been deceased for a while, long enough that rigor mortis had already set in. The realization hit me slowly, the paramedic's words filtering in piece by piece. The woman I had just spoken to on the phone had been dead for hours. There was no possible way she could have made the call. The details made no sense. The woman had responded to me clearly during the call. Her breathing had been labored, yes, but she had spoken in full sentences. I had kept her on the line, heard the ticking of a clock in the background and the quiet noises of a house at night. I had guided her through the conversation, reassured her help was on the way. The call had ended as expected, with her hanging up when I told her the ambulance had arrived. Everything about it felt normal, until now. The paramedics were just as baffled, confirming that the woman had been dead for quite some time. They searched the house for any other signs of life, but aside from her husband, who was found asleep in another room, there was no one else. The sheriff confirmed the scene was quiet and undisturbed, only adding to the confusion. The facts didn't line up with what I knew, what I had heard. As I sat there, reviewing the call in my mind, I could still hear her voice as if it were echoing through the room. The weight of the discovery sank in, leaving a deep, unsettling feeling that lingered long after the paramedics had moved on to the hospital. What had seemed like a routine call had taken a disturbing, inexplicable turn that none of us could explain. After the supervisor and paramedics exchanged details, it became clear the situation was far more unusual than anyone had expected. The elderly woman I had spoken to, whose voice I clearly remembered, whose breathing I had monitored on the call, had been found in a state of rigor mortis. She hadn't just passed away moments before the EMTs arrived. She had been dead for hours, long before the call had ever been placed. The realization hit like a slow wave of disbelief. I had kept her on the line, hearing her voice weaken, offering reassurances, and yet the paramedics were saying there was no way she could have made that call. In the following minutes, the paramedics and sheriff's unit thoroughly checked the house, searching for any other explanation. They confirmed the place was quiet and undisturbed. Her husband had been found in a back room, still asleep and completely unaware of what had transpired. There was no one else in the house, no signs of forced entry or tampering with any phone lines. Everything about the scene was normal, except for one glaring, impossible detail. The woman I'd just spoken to was gone. Not just recently, but long enough for her body to be stiff with rigor mortis. I sat there in the dispatch room, staring at the call logs, trying to reconcile what I had experienced. The other dispatchers, having replayed the call, confirmed it had indeed been her voice on the line. Every detail matched. Her name, the address, her distinctive, familiar voice, slightly strained from breathing difficulties, just as it had been during previous calls. Nothing about the call had seemed out of the ordinary at the time. She had responded to my questions, told me her husband was asleep, and acknowledged the ambulance's arrival at her door. How could that be? The eerie part wasn't just that I had spoken to her after she had died. It was how normal the call had felt in the moment. The quiet ticking of the clock in her home, the occasional faint sound of furniture creaking as she likely shifted her weight. It had all felt so real, so present. I could still hear the faint wheeze of her breath as she spoke, struggling but coherent, right up until the moment she hung up. The paramedics were equally unsettled. They had initially assumed that I had made an error, perhaps confused the caller or the timing, but after the call playback, there was no denying it. They had spoken to my supervisor, confirming every detail, but it only deepened the mystery. How could I have been speaking to a woman who had already passed hours earlier? The doctors at the hospital were similarly baffled when they were informed of the situation. When the ambulance transferred the body, the hospital staff double-checked everything. Despite their initial skepticism, they found no mistakes. The time of death clearly preceded my call, making the events all the more incomprehensible. In the days that followed, I replayed the call in my head over and over again. There was no rational explanation, no detail I could point to that made sense. I found myself thinking back to the moment she had hung up, after calmly saying okay when I told her the ambulance was at her door. That single word felt more loaded now, carrying an eerie finality that I hadn't recognized at the time. Had she known, in some inexplicable way, that this would be our last conversation? The experience stayed with me long after the shift ended. It wasn't just the impossibility of what had happened that unsettled me. It was the feeling that somehow I had been part of something beyond my understanding. The stillness of her house, the ticking clock, and the quiet background sounds of her life still played in my mind. But now they were colored by the knowledge that she hadn't been alive at the time of our conversation. I couldn't shake the sense that something deeply mysterious had occurred that night, leaving a lingering unease that I still can't explain. It was one of those late afternoons where we didn't have much to do, so my buddy and I decided to check out the old hospital we'd been hearing about for a while. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, a relic from decades past, now left to decay on the edge of town. The kind of place kids would dare each other to go near, but no one really did. The local rumors weren't about ghosts or hauntings, but more about the strange and often dangerous people who sometimes hung around places like that. Vagrants, drifters, maybe even addicts. But we figured it'd be a cool spot to sit, drink some beers, and get a decent view of the city from the roof. The hospital itself wasn't anything special. Just a long, low building with cracked windows and graffiti scrawled across the walls. The lot was overgrown, weeds and small trees pushing through the asphalt, and the structure looked like it had been slowly eaten away by time and weather. It was the kind of place that, even in daylight, gave you the feeling that something was off. The sun was starting to dip lower as we arrived, casting long shadows that made the place look even more deserted. We knew from friends who had been there before that the only way to the roof was via a large square staircase that spiraled around the outside of the building. The bottom of the staircase was locked up with a big steel door that had rusted shut long ago. No getting through that without heavy tools. So the only option was to climb up the side of the building to the first landing, about 10 feet up. It wasn't too high, but high enough to make you think twice. Still, we had come all this way, and backing out now wasn't really an option. My friend gave me a boost, and with a bit of effort, I grabbed onto the railing and hauled myself over. As soon as I got up there, I noticed something strange. Right on the concrete of the landing, tucked up against the wall, was a sleeping bag, and not one that looked old and forgotten, but a fairly clean one, like someone had been using it recently. Next to it was a steak knife, just lying there, the blade reflecting the last bit of sunlight. I froze for a second, taking it in. This wasn't just some left-behind junk. The placement was deliberate. Someone had been staying here, and judging by the condition of the sleeping bag, probably not that long ago. I felt my chest tighten a bit. This wasn't what I had signed up for. We had come to explore and hang out, but suddenly it felt like we might have walked into someone else's space. Someone who wasn't expecting company. I leaned over the railing, trying to keep my voice low but steady. We're definitely not alone here, dude. I called down to my friend. I expected some kind of reassuring joke from him, maybe for him to brush it off as nothing, but I never got the chance to hear his response. Before I could even turn back around, a voice came from behind me. It wasn't my friend's. The voice behind me sent a shock through my body, every hair on the back of my neck standing up. I spun around, heart pounding, and there he was. A young guy, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, standing halfway up the staircase above me. He was dirty, his clothes worn and stained, looking like someone who had been living rough for a while. His hands were raised in the air, palms out, as if to show he wasn't a threat. Still, the shock of seeing someone there after being so sure we were alone made my stomach flip. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice calm but tired, like this was just another ordinary moment for him. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. He didn't seem aggressive, but the situation was far from normal, and my brain was still trying to catch up with what was happening. I glanced at the sleeping bag and the steak knife again, realizing this must be his setup. My eyes flicked back to him, sizing him up, noting how skinny and tired he looked, like someone who had been out on the streets for too long. He stepped down a few stairs and sat down casually, as if he had nowhere else to be. The tension in my body didn't ease, though. I wasn't sure what his intentions were, and the suddenness of his appearance had rattled me. Meanwhile, my friend was still waiting below, probably wondering what was taking so long. I carefully stepped on the handle of the steak knife, just in case, and leaned over the edge to call him up. "Hey, come up here. We've got company." I tried to keep my voice casual, but I knew he'd pick up on the unease in my tone. My friend climbed up, and I helped pull him over the railing. The moment he saw the guy sitting on the stairs, his eyes widened slightly, but he didn't say anything right away. The three of us stood there in an awkward silence for a few beats, with the man just sitting on the stairs, watching us. We hadn't expected this. We thought we'd just have the place to ourselves, explore the rooftop, drink a couple of beers, take in the view. Now there was this guy, and it was clear he had been staying here, using the landing as his temporary home. The atmosphere felt thick, like the weight of the situation was hanging over us. In an attempt to break the tension, we offered him a beer. It felt like the safest, most neutral move we could make, trying to extend some sort of goodwill. He accepted it, gratefully cracking it open and taking a long sip. The three of us ended up talking for a bit, about the city, how long he had been drifting around, just making general conversation. He told us he'd been in town for about a week, moving from place to place, staying wherever he could find shelter. There was a certain openness about him that almost made you forget the knife lying nearby, or the fact that we were on an abandoned hospital staircase, talking to a complete stranger. For a while, it almost felt normal, like we could just hang out for a bit and then go on our way. But just when things were starting to feel calm, his tone shifted, and he asked us a question that immediately froze the air around us. "You guys are human, right?" There was a long pause. My friend and I exchanged a quick glance, neither of us sure how to respond. He wasn't smiling, and there was no hint of a joke in his voice. "I hate it when I meet people that end up being aliens," he continued, staring into his beer as if he was having a casual conversation. "And you never know until you check it physically. They've been after me a long time, you know. They don't stop. They never stop." His voice grew quieter, almost as if he was talking to himself now. "Sometimes I think I should just end everyone to be safe." Everything changed in that moment. The lighthearted, if tense conversation we had been having was gone, replaced with something darker, something that made my skin crawl. My friend and I exchanged another glance, silently acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. This guy wasn't joking. He was genuinely paranoid, and it was clear now that he wasn't in a good mental space. The tension returned tenfold, and I could feel the urgency in my chest telling me it was time to get out of there. I nodded slowly, trying to stay calm. "Yeah, man. We're human. We're just here to check out the place and have a few beers. We don't want any trouble." He didn't respond right away, just stared at us, unblinking. The silence stretched on uncomfortably as we stood there, waiting for his reaction, unsure of what he might do next. The silence after my response felt like it stretched forever. My heart was pounding in my chest, the tension thick in the air. The guy just sat there, staring at us with a blank expression. His eyes were unsettling, not angry, but distant, like his mind was somewhere far away. He didn't move, didn't say anything, and that only made the situation worse. My friend and I stood there, frozen, unsure of what would happen next. We had just been making small talk with this guy a few minutes ago, sharing beers, and now we were standing on edge, trying to figure out if we were in real danger. The steak knife was still lying near the sleeping bag, its handle barely visible under my foot. I was hyper-aware of it, knowing it was the only thing between us and the man who was clearly unstable. He hadn't made a move toward it, but his strange comments about aliens and ending everyone were enough to make me feel that things could escalate at any moment. My friend shifted slightly beside me, probably thinking the same thing, how to get out of there without triggering him. "Yeah, man, we're just going to go ahead and move on now," I said, keeping my voice as calm and casual as possible. "We didn't mean to bother you. We were just checking out the place, but we'll head out." Still, he didn't respond, just kept staring. His eyes flicked from me to my friend and back again. My friend nodded, playing along, and we both started inching backward toward the railing. Every step felt like it took forever. I didn't want to turn my back on him, not knowing what he might do. He was still sitting, but the way he had dropped that comment about ending everyone so casually stuck in my head, like a warning that he was more dangerous than he appeared. We reached the railing and carefully lowered ourselves over it. My friend went first, and I followed, trying to keep my eyes on the guy the whole time. I could feel the sweat starting to drip down my back, my pulse racing as we lowered ourselves down the 10-foot drop. The moment my feet hit the ground, we moved quickly, not quite running, but walking fast enough that we could make some distance between us and him. I glanced over my shoulder as we walked, half expecting him to be following us down the stairs or watching us from the landing. Sure enough, when I looked back, he was standing there, completely still, just watching us with that same blank expression. He didn't shout, didn't move, just stood there in silence, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. The sight of him standing there, so still, gave me a chill that I couldn't shake. We didn't stop walking until we were far enough away from the building to feel like we were out of his reach. The whole time, we kept glancing back, making sure he wasn't behind us. The abandoned hospital seemed to loom larger as we got farther away, the dark, decaying structure towering over us like something out of a nightmare. The air felt thick, and even though we were out in the open, it was hard to shake the feeling that he could be watching us, following us. Finally, when we were far enough away, we slowed down. We didn't say much at first, both of us too rattled to really talk about what had just happened. I felt the adrenaline slowly leaving my body, replaced by an uneasy tension that lingered in the pit of my stomach. We had gotten out of there without any incident, but the encounter had left a mark. That place, the abandoned hospital, still stands, as far as I know. It's been 5 years, and neither of us has ever gone back. Every time I pass it, I can't help but think of that night, of the guy sitting on the stairs with his beer, talking about aliens and ending everyone. I'm not someone who believes in the supernatural, but there's something about people, how unpredictable they can be, how quickly things can turn, that unsettles me far more than any ghost story. The memory of that man, his distant stare and unsettling words, still haunts me. We walked away that night, but I'll never forget the feeling that in that moment, we were close to something truly dangerous. We were around 12 years old, and like most kids with too much free time, we were always looking for something adventurous to do. There were 4 of us that day, and we'd heard about this underground flood channel, an old drainage system that ran beneath the streets of our neighborhood. It was one of those places you'd hear about through rumors, stories passed around by older kids, but none of us had actually been down there before. So naturally, we figured it was our turn to explore it. We found the entrance at the edge of a park we often played in. It was a big concrete opening, not hidden but not exactly in plain sight either, surrounded by overgrown weeds and litter. We had to crouch a bit to get inside, and as soon as we did, it was like stepping into another world. The air inside was cool and damp, with a faint smell of mildew and stagnant water. The sound of dripping water echoed off the concrete walls, and the sunlight from outside quickly faded as we moved deeper into the tunnel. There wasn't much light except for the single flashlight we had, and we were careful to make sure it didn't die on us. The tunnel started out square, with the ceiling and walls covered in graffiti, random names, gang tags, and crude drawings. Some of the messages were warnings like "turn back" or "danger," but we shrugged them off. It seemed like something other kids had scribbled there to scare people, and we weren't going to let that stop us. The further we went, the darker and more isolated it felt. The ground beneath us was damp, and a small trickle of water ran through the center of the tunnel. We could hear our footsteps splashing lightly as we walked, and every now and then we'd stop to listen for any sounds from above or around us. About every few hundred feet, we'd come across storm drains above our heads. These were openings in the ceiling of the tunnel that connected to the streets above. Sometimes we'd hear cars passing or muffled voices from the surface, a distant reminder of the world we'd left behind. A few of these drains had diagonal pipes leading up to them, and we took turns climbing up, reaching our arms through the gaps to wave at the unsuspecting people walking by above. It gave us a strange sense of power, like we were hidden beneath the city. seeing it from a perspective no one else had. But the deeper we went, the more the tunnel changed. The graffiti became denser, almost overwhelming, and the warnings seemed to multiply. The messages were bolder, spray-painted in big letters: "Turn back now," "Dead end ahead." The walls were covered with strange symbols we didn't recognize, and we started to get the feeling that maybe we weren't the first group of kids to come this far. It wasn't enough to scare us off yet, but there was a growing tension, something unspoken that passed between us. No one wanted to be the one to say, maybe we should go back, so we kept going. At one point, the ceiling began to get lower. The tunnel started sloping down until it was so tight we had to crouch. That didn't bother us at first. It was just another part of the adventure. We figured it would open back up soon, but the further we went, the more we realized that to keep moving forward, we'd have to crawl. The opening ahead was small, barely big enough for us to squeeze through on our hands and knees. It was the kind of space where you could feel the walls closing in around you, the concrete rough against your skin. I remember holding the flashlight and shining it ahead, seeing that the tunnel did open up again a few feet further on. We were all in agreement that we should go for it. It was only a short crawl, and we'd come too far to turn back now. It seemed like just another obstacle, something that made the adventure more exciting. So one by one, we dropped to the ground and started crawling. The air in that part of the tunnel was different, thicker, almost stifling, with the smell of damp concrete and stagnant water more intense than before. The flashlight beam bounced off the walls as we moved, the light casting weird shadows as we shuffled through the low space. It felt longer than the few feet it really was, and by the time we got to the other side, we were relieved to stand up again. After crawling through the tight space, we emerged into what felt like a completely different part of the flood channel. The tunnel had shifted from the square or rectangular concrete walls we were used to into a large, round concrete pipe. It felt bigger and more open, but at the same time, the emptiness made it feel more isolated. The walls were still covered in graffiti, layers upon layers of different tags and messages, some old and faded, others freshly painted. The flashlight beam danced along the rough concrete surface, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched across the curved walls. We stood there for a moment, adjusting to the new space, trying to get a sense of where we were. The echoes of our footsteps sounded louder here, bouncing off the rounded walls in a way that made the space feel both vast and enclosed at the same time. It was colder, too. The air was damp and smelled even more stale, like it had been trapped down here for years without moving. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, from the scuff of our shoes to the quiet drip of water somewhere in the distance. At first, we were excited. This new section felt different, like we had reached a part of the tunnel that few others had ventured into. We started messing around, yelling out random things just to hear the echoes bounce back at us from the darkness. It was kind of fun, like we had our own secret underground world. Our voices seemed to stretch on forever, growing quieter as they reverberated through the tunnel. But after a few minutes of goofing around, something shifted. As we were yelling, we thought we heard something else, another sound coming from deeper within the pipe. It was faint at first, so we stopped talking and listened. The echoes from our voices faded, and the tunnel fell into a heavy silence. The only sound left was the distant dripping water and our own breathing, which suddenly felt much louder in the stillness. We stood there for what felt like forever, waiting, straining our ears to catch the faintest hint of a noise, and then cutting through the silence we heard it, clearer this time. A voice, distant but distinct, coming from the darkness ahead. It was hard to make out at first, but the words slowly echoed back to us, repeating over and over, "You are going to fucking die." The voice was loud, far louder than it should have been given how far away it sounded. It echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it hard to tell exactly where it was coming from. But it didn't matter. Hearing those words in the middle of an empty, pitch-black tunnel underground made my blood run cold. It wasn't one of us, that much was certain. My heart started pounding in my chest. I could feel the tension rising between the four of us as we all exchanged wide-eyed looks, silently asking each other the same question. Did Did you hear that? The kid holding the flashlight, our only source of light in this vast, dark space, was the first to react. Before any of us could say anything, he turned and bolted, sprinting back the way we had come. The beam from the flashlight swung wildly as he ran, casting dizzying flashes of light on the walls before disappearing altogether, leaving the rest of us standing there in total darkness. The moment the light vanished, everything changed. The pitch blackness was suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. I could hear my friends breathing heavily, their footsteps shuffling as they stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The sound of the voice still echoed faintly in the back of my mind, like a ghostly reminder of how alone we were down here. None of us moved for a few seconds, as if we were too scared to make a sound. My heart was racing, my skin crawling with the sense that we weren't alone in that tunnel anymore. The weight of the darkness was overwhelming, and without the flashlight, it was impossible to tell which way was which. There was a moment where we all stood still, just listening, trying to figure out if the voice was real or if we had imagined it. But there was no mistaking it. We had all heard the same thing. None of us spoke, too scared to break the silence, too afraid that whoever or whatever had yelled would hear us. I could feel the tension between us, each of us breathing heavily, unsure of what to do next. We couldn't run blindly through the tunnel in the pitch dark. It wasn't just the fear of tripping or getting lost, it was the fear of what might be waiting for us in the darkness ahead. I remember the weight of the air down there. It felt heavier now, oppressive. Every slight movement I made, shuffling my feet, brushing against the wall, sounded amplified, like it would carry for miles in the tunnel. The echoes of our earlier voices had long since faded, but that other voice, whoever it was, seemed to hang in the air, like it had changed the energy of the space. It wasn't the playful exploration anymore. It was something darker. One of my friends whispered something, but it was too quiet to make out, just a soft murmur in the dark. I could tell he was trying to calm himself down, trying to get us to stay focused. But it didn't matter. We were all too freaked out. After what felt like an eternity of standing there in silence, the reality of the situation started to set in. We had to get out. Slowly, we began to move. Without the flashlight, we had no choice but to feel our way through the darkness. I ran my hands along the rough, cold surface of the tunnel wall, keeping my other hand out in front of me, hoping I wouldn't stumble into anything or anyone. My other friends did the same, their footsteps barely audible against the concrete floor. It felt like we were walking forever, moving at a snail's pace, unsure of which way we were even going. The fear of losing each other in the blackness was terrifying, so we stayed close, bumping into each other occasionally, none of us daring to stray too far from the group. Every so often I would stop, convinced I had heard something behind us, footsteps, breathing, something. But there was nothing, just the same oppressive silence, broken only by our nervous movements. My heart raced with every step, and the further we went, the more I started to feel like something was wrong. That voice, it was too real, too deliberate. Someone had to be down there with us. At one point, we reached the low part of the tunnel we had crawled through earlier. I remember feeling a deep sense of dread as we realized we had to crawl back through it to get out. It was bad enough going in, but now, with that voice still fresh in our minds, the thought of crawling through that tight, claustrophobic space in the dark was terrifying. What if someone was waiting on the other side? What if we were walking right into a trap, but we didn't have a choice? We had to move forward. We couldn't stay in the tunnel, frozen in fear, waiting for something to happen. One by one, we dropped to our hands and knees and started crawling back through the low section, each of us feeling the weight of the concrete pressing in from all sides. Every scrape of our hands against the floor echoed back at us, amplifying the panic that was building inside. As I crawled, I kept expecting to hear something behind me. Every noise seemed amplified, every small sound magnified in the narrow space. The tunnel felt even longer than it had on the way in, and by the time I reached the other side and stood up, my whole body was trembling. When we finally made it back to the larger part of the tunnel, we paused for a moment, catching our breath. The fear was still there, but the further we moved from the voice, the more we felt like we could make it out. I glanced back at the pitch-black tunnel behind us, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just darkness. We kept moving, our pace quickening now that we were closer to the entrance. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw the faintest hint of daylight filtering through one of the storm drains above. It was weak, but in that moment, it was like seeing a lifeline. We climbed up, one by one, gripping the rusty metal bars of the drain and pulling ourselves up toward the light. When we emerged back into the world above, blinking in the sunlight, it felt like we had left something behind in that tunnel, something we didn't want to think about anymore. We didn't talk much as we made our way home, our hearts still pounding from the encounter. All of us were shaken, but no one wanted to admit it. We never went back to that flood channel. None of us ever talked about it again. But even now, years later, I still remember the feeling of that voice echoing through the darkness, the way it seemed to cut through the tunnel like a knife. We may not have died that day, but something about that place still haunts me.